Hello, and welcome to Writer's Corner. Today's June 25th, 2010, and it's the first anniversary of Michael Jackson's passing. Sorry, I was just waiting for the red light, but that's okay, keep it rolling. It's also the second anniversary of George Carlin's passing, which was
June 22nd. So.
And my guest is James Sullivan, who wrote the new book, 7 Dirty Words, The Life and Crimes of George Carlin. Welcome.
Thanks for having me.
To Writer's Corner. Don't mind me, it's my first time on the air. I'm just got to get used to. After 30 years, it's my every day is the first time. Compelling
You're doing
book.
fine, Joe.
Thank you. Compelling book, great book. My question is why? After you wrote about blue jeans and you wrote about James Brown.
Right. Why Carlin?
Fashion.
Yeah.
Rhythm and blues.
Right.
Comedy.
Right. I've been a pop culture journalist for about 20 years now. Spent 10 years at the San Francisco Chronicle. I was originally hired as a pop music critic, which is where the James Brown book, my second book, comes from. But I pretty quickly started covering a real broad range of pop culture, different aspects of popular culture. And it was all across the board, from fashion to toys, what kids do with their free time, comedy, all kinds of aspects of popular culture, arts, and entertainment that fell through the cracks with a lot of the other staff writers at the Chronicle. Newspapers tend to have very rigidly defined, there's a classical music critic, there used to be jazz critics, there's a rock and pop music critic, there's a movie critic. But I covered a lot of stuff that sort of fell between the cracks, and one of those things was comedy. Newspapers tend not to typically have someone who covers comedy on a regular basis. So I did a lot of interviewing of comedians, including Carlin. Anytime a big name comedian, whether it was Jerry Seinfeld or Bill Cosby, came to town, I would interview them or review the show, or both.
What time frame did you interview Carlin?
I interviewed Carlin about 10 years ago or so, I think.
San Francisco?
In San Francisco.
Cool.
And among other things, I wrote a lot of sort of what we call trend pieces in the newspaper business. And an ongoing trend for the last several decades, I'd have to say, in popular culture is swearing, is the use of dirty words. So I always had it in the back of my mind that there was something to the idea of Carlin's routine, the 7 words you can never say on television, and the fact that, in my mind, it's a watershed moment. It's a moment where everything prior to that routine, when he recorded it in 1972, clearly we had that language in American culture, but we also swept it under the rug. We tried to pretend, especially where kids were concerned, that those words didn't exist. You didn't hear them in the movie theaters. You certainly didn't hear them on TV or on the radio. And everything that's happened since he recorded that routine and started doing it regularly, when he analyzed the words and said, I'm not just speaking them gratuitously, I'm asking the question, why do we fear these words? What is it about these words that makes us so afraid of them?
I have a good question there. Yeah. Who would be bigger, or would they be on the same scale, Gore Vidal or George Carlin?
Bigger in terms of
fame and notoriety, probably Gore Vidal worldwide.
Probably worldwide or in literary circles, but I'd have to say that Carlin, just because of his TV exposure, and not just HBO, but the fact that he was, well before the HBO years, George Carlin was a known commodity on network TV. Early 70s, he was a regular guest host for Johnny Carson on The Tonight Show, so he was a very mainstream comedian in his day.
And my point is this, when Myra Breckinridge came up,
sure.
Gore Vidal, do you remember Myron, the sequel?
Uh-huh.
Do you know what he did in the sequel, which
not.
had to do with the 7 Dirty Words?
I do not, actually.
Well, in Myron, the sequel to Myra Breckinridge, where Myra goes back to being a man, Myron, he changes the 7 Dirty Words to the 7 Supreme Court justices' names. So when he uses the word about a male appendage, it's a Rehnquist.
Right.
Which was Judge Rehnquist.
Well, did he actually refer to Carlin, or did he just say...
No, he just said...
obscene words and changing...
he says, in order not to have an obscene book, right, I'm going to substitute the obscenities with the names of the justices that voted.
Right.
So it's great, because you read the book, and a Rehnquist, you can't get it out of your mind. It's
right. Well, that's like Norman Mailer's first book, right? The Naked and the Dead, right? Which in throughout the book, I think it was written in about 1949 or so, and throughout the book he uses the expletive FUG Fug, and that's where the rock band from the 60s took their name, the Fugs.
Great
they
band.
took their name from Mailer doing the same thing, trying to circumvent the censors by using something that was pretty close but not quite there.
And they had a song about Coca-Cola, which we can't say, which I won't say on my show.
There you go.
But you know what I'm talking about, right?
I do, yeah.
Okay, the Fugs. Look it up, kids. Coca-Cola something. And don't try it at home. Right. But my point about Myron Breckinridge is that why did George Carlin have the watershed moment? It took a long time to get to that question when Gore Vidal was just as famous and did this great thing with the 7 dirty words. Why was it just the choice of 7 dirty words?
Partly because the routine was extremely funny, and it got a lot of attention because it was funny. And he made what seemed at the time like a very valid point. You know, he didn't just, like I said, he didn't just say the words for the sake of saying them. Lenny Bruce was Carlin's idol. Lenny Bruce obviously got into a lot of legal hot water for saying the words. And one of Lenny Bruce's things was that he would say one of the 7 words, and he would say, let's just take the fangs out of it. Let's just see, if I just say that word again and again and again, just keep repeating it, it kind of starts to sound silly and not offensive anymore. It just sounds ridiculous. And he would do that on stage sometimes. But you could argue that was a gratuitous use of the word, just to see what would happen. And Lenny Bruce, you know, his downfall was that his timing wasn't good. He was trying to push to the furthest limits of the freedom of expression at a time, the 1950s, when the American culture wasn't quite ready for it yet.
Oh, absolutely not.
And Carlin, who grew up, came into comedy idolizing Lenny Bruce and didn't idolize anybody in his life. Carlin, you know, couldn't stand institutions, also couldn't stand the idea of role models and looking up to another human being on a pedestal above yourself. But he did idolize Lenny Bruce. And Carlin, you know, came along at the right time. He was 10 or 15 years younger than Lenny. And by the time he decided to do the 7 words routine, it was 1972, and the culture had changed completely. And so here's this ponytailed, bearded, hippie character who didn't just repeat the words, you know, ad nauseum just to see what the effect would be like Lenny did. He actually wrote the routine analyzing the words and saying, just questioning the language and just saying, if there's 400,000 words in the English language, what is it about these 7 that, you know, need to be in a box over here separated from all the others? How bad can they be? And part of his point was there are a lot of brutal things in the world. Why should we make language one more of them? It's, you know, in his mind, sort of towards the bottom of the list is worrying about how people talk.
Well, my college professor back at Suffolk University, Dr. Richard Carlson, he would say if you said a word enough, it would lose its effect. And there's that word that rhymes with F, but begins with S, that seems to have lost its effect. People can say it now and it doesn't mean anything.
Right, and you also think about, you know, sort of ethnic slurs. The groups themselves, in many cases, I mean, gay people just started saying, we're sick of being called queer, we're going to call ourselves queer, and take the fangs out of that word. So, you know, I mean, I was in San Francisco for 10 years. The gay community in San Francisco, they're queer, and they use the word to the point where if a homophobic person called a gay person queer, it wouldn't have any effect anymore because he's already calling himself queer. So, I mean, that's, you know, there's a long history of that, of, you know, sort of defanging the words by the repetition of them. And in Carlin's case, other than network TV and commercial radio, these words are, you know, ubiquitous in our culture at this point.
But there are African American people out there who hate the fact that rappers are using the N-word. And they don't like doing what the gays are doing. Right. Some of the gays are doing, not all the gays are doing it.
That's true. Right.
Some are more reserved.
Right.
And so you get these militant factions in any ethnic group.
Right.
Or culture.
Right. And Carlin actually did a later routine, much later in his life, where he talked about ethnic slurs and talked about the fact that in his mind, the ethnic slurs, if they were clearly offensive to the group in question, those were the only words he struck from his own language. He said, you know, he did a whole routine about that, and of course he made it funny, but he talked about that. He said, you know, if the group doesn't want to be called this, that, or the other thing, then fine, I'm not, you know, who am I to use that word? But the 7 words, you know, in his mind, aren't inherently offensive to anyone unless, you know, you have a puritanical upbringing to believe that, you know, the F word or the S word are words that you should have to wash your mouth out with soap if you hear them or use them.
How did Carlin feel about violent words?
Yeah, well, that was part of the point of the original routine, exactly that. He part of the routine actually is let's substitute the violent word for the dirty word and see where it gets us. I mean, he felt like, you know, to say kill or murder was, you know, just as offensive in his mind as to say one of the dirty words.
I think it's more offensive, but that's my own personal.
Sure.
So you interviewed him about 10 years ago in San Francisco.
Yeah.
When did you get the idea for the book?
Well, I'd had the idea for the book for years, for many years.
Good.
Had wanted to write the book for years. Personal story, I just kind of grew up, if it's not already obvious, I grew up using the dirty words in a home where my father was a New Yorker and just, you know, didn't think, he kind of shared Carlin's sentiment. He didn't think that it was such a big deal for a kid to understand these words. He just figured it's real life, you're going to hear them. He used them. When I started using them, it wasn't his biggest concern. He had other things to, you know, yell at me about. The words were not one of them. So, you know, I've always loved Carlin's humor. Kind of watched his career as it developed, you know, knew the early records from when I was a kid, and then watched his career as it developed, and had it in the back of my mind that this cultural moment, besides the 7 words routine, Carlin's career, unlike any other stand-up comedian that I could think of, spans the entire modern era of American comedy. From the late 1950s when he got started, when he was idolizing Lenny Bruce and Mort Sahl, the two big names in the comedy revolution of the 1950s, up through the hippie era, the sort of loudmouthed me era of the 1980s, when Sam Kinison and Andrew Dice Clay and Bill Hicks became famous.
Kind of chronicled with the photos.
Yeah,
in here.
Right, and he kind of covered the whole range of 50 years of American comedy, and, you know, he just had the good fortune of living through the whole thing. He was 20 in the late 50s, and he lived to be 71 through up to almost the present day. So he covered, you know, a really large span and represented a large span of American comedy. So between those two things, I felt like his body of work, which is considerable. I mean, if you talk to any comedian, they'll say, wow, Carlin just wrote more comedy than any of the rest of us. And, you know, I just felt like his body of work was worth a critical look, in the same way that the music of the Beatles, let's say, there's plenty of books out there that are about not so much the personalities of the Beatles, but the music that they made together, or the films of, let's say, Alfred Hitchcock, or a famous, you know, Scorsese, or a famous film director, can stand on their own to be analyzed from a cultural perspective, almost aside from the personal story. Not that this isn't a biography, it is, but really what I set out first and foremost to do is to, I'm calling it a critical biography. I'm looking at 50 years of his work and what it said about American culture.
7 words you can never say on television, and that's chapter 7. Mm-hmm. You had to do that.
Mm-hmm. Sure. I mean, I actually named all the chapters after the routines on his breakthrough album, which is Class Clown, which is the album that came out in 1972 that had that routine, but also had a lot of stuff about his transformation from his clean-cut years, when in the early to mid-60s he was looked like any other comedian on TV, skinny tie, hair slicked back, no beard, no facial hair, was trying to attract the attention of Merv Griffin and The Tonight Show to get, you know, he figured eventually maybe he'd get a sitcom or something. And by the late 60s, not only was he realizing that he had a much closer affinity for the hippie counterculture that was coming up then, but he also realized that the Hollywood at the time really wasn't where he wanted to be, that he was feeling, you know, boxed in, and that he couldn't speak freely, and that he couldn't talk from his own heart and talk honestly about the things that were funny to him. He felt like he was writing jokes for somebody else to be funny on TV with, and so a lot of the Class Clown album is about his transformation, about growing up Catholic and realizing that he had, you know, a real serious inherent gene for questioning authority, and then realizing that although he was already 33 by 1970, he was a lot closer to the 20-somethings of that era than the 40-year-olds that he had originally thought should be his target audience.
Today, Friday the 25th of June, WODS Radio is playing nonstop Michael Jackson. Mm-hmm. And there's a ultimate thriller concert in Lynn tonight at the Lynn Auditorium. Mm-hmm. It would seem that with the second anniversary of the passing of George Carlin, TV would be throwing little clips in, or little, you know, just, you can throw bits in on the radio. Mm-hmm. Why do we not see this with comedians?
You know where he lives on is the web.
Really? Okay, good answer to the question.
He's a huge, hugely popular, sort of YouTube videos of him are hugely popular. And I've recently been converted to Twitter. You know, tweeting, and there are a lot of people actually who shoot out, quotes from George Carlin, one-liners from Carlin. He just had a very quizzical, sort of philosophical bent to a lot of his humor. A lot of it is not dirty at all. A lot of it is just mild, silly stuff. A lot of it is silly stuff about the language, like if a pig loses his voice, is he disgruntled? Just like ridiculously silly stuff that would make kids laugh. That's as clean as it can be. And there's lots of people actually on Twitter there's a guy who actually has a Twitter post where he just posts a Carlin quote every day. That's all he does. So,
wow.
So I would say that that's where Carlin lives on. And he also kept himself up front in the culture up until the end of his life, between doing a new HBO special every couple of years to writing his series of books towards the end of his life. The last decade or 15 years of his life, he was publishing his own books of jokes, and all three of them made the New York Times bestseller list. So, he kept himself at the forefront of the culture, until he passed away.
On page 78, you bring up the John Davidson at Notre Dame, a 1-hour special he worked on with Spanky and our gang, one of our friends here at on the show. How did he meet Spanky through?
Yeah, he met Spanky. Let me see if I can remember correctly. He met the band probably in Chicago when they were working. That's where he met her. They were working the clubs in Chicago.
She was in the New Wine Singers before it was Spanky and our gang.
And Carlin worked before he started getting his TV gigs in the early '60s. He was mostly working in the Greenwich Village clubs, alongside Woody Allen and Bill Cosby and Richard Pryor, all these comedians who became extremely famous, but were really working the tiny clubs in New York, Greenwich Village, and then the similar circuit in other big cities like Chicago. And there were a lot of comedy clubs. A lot of the comedy clubs in those days were sort of a combination. You probably know this, but combination comedy and folk music clubs. So it would be just a sort of low-key nightclub atmosphere. You might see the next Simon and Garfunkel playing some music, and then you might see the next Richard Pryor get up and do some jokes. So that was where he spent a lot of his time for a few years, and that he met Spanky from the group in one of the nightclubs in Chicago where they were both working. And she actually made a joke to me when I was talking to her about how she met Carlin. She said something like, "We met over the pool table," and then she went, "And by that I don't mean I was lying on the pool table." Something like that. I mean, she's raunchy, but she was really funny about
fantastic.
it. And he bonded with the whole band. I think partly because they all had an affinity for smoking pot, which a lot of people did in those days, obviously. But they remained friends throughout their lives, and I think that Carlin was very close to Spanky throughout his life.
Oh, if you go see Spanky these days, ask her for a brownie.
Yeah, right.
She does the medical thing out there. With,
Still lives in California, right?
Yeah, and she does medical marijuana brownies. Fascinating stuff, man. We could talk to you for 10 ounces. You're just a wealth of information. And a lot of the stuff you're telling us probably isn't in the book, because you're going into we're getting your perspective too, which is good.
Yeah.
Did it take you a long time to write, since you had it in you for years?
Yeah, you know what? Not really. Nature of the business. My publisher, Carlin passed away, and my publisher said, we'd love to get the book out sooner rather than later. So. A couple people have said, how did you do your research? And other than interviewing all kinds of people who knew Carlin and worked with him, or were friends with him, or people like Spanky who knew him from the business, a huge part of the research, obviously, was basically studying again and again all 14 of the HBO specials, all of the couple dozen or whatever the number is albums, and every television and cable and movie appearance that I could get my hands on. So I mean, it was kind of it was a lot of fun, actually, to research. Sitting down with all kinds of comedy stacked up around me and listening to it or watching it. That part of the research, I have to say, was not exactly grueling. And
you got great notes in index, which is important.
Yeah. Well, I wanted to make sure that everything was attributed properly. And one of the great things about Carlin was that although he wasn't around for me to follow-up interview with, when I started writing about the 7 words. The interviews that he gave throughout his life were very, just as honest as his comedy, very frank, very self-aware, very much, in tune with where he wanted to go with the comedy. The guy was a workaholic. I mean, he worked on comedy 24/7 throughout his life, always thinking in terms of what's funny and how can I make that funny and how can I write something funny around that. And he was extremely honest. So when he did major interviews, he was one of the most upfront, personalities you could ever imagine, talking about his own shortcomings as well as his, better moments. And so, I found that if I, as deep as I could dig into archival stuff, old magazine interviews and things, I found a lot of stuff just from that, where other personalities might have been more guarded, and he was completely upfront about the whole span of his life, mostly because his whole life was devoted to comedy, and the work was his life.
And it's good to be devoted to something. Is there a point where professionalism turns into obsession, or vice versa?
No, he was obsessed. I would definitely say so. I mean, he was absolutely obsessed. I mean, I talked to a number of comedians who, who he was friends with, who were not particularly famous, but who were equally obsessive about comedy, and that's why he was friendly with them. I mean, they were, two weirdos connecting on the same wavelength that not everybody could connect on, because they were just constant. Their minds were just constantly churning. Is that funny? Is that not funny? If it's not funny, throw it out. If it is funny, let's keep going with it and see where we can take it and turn it into a bit or a routine. I mean, a lot of comedians work that way. I think that he was a perfect example of a guy who devoted, every instant of his waking life, and probably most of his dream life too, to figuring out what's funny and what's not. And if it's not funny, it's not worth anything. And
still, it's good that his personality rose above all that, so that he could be a public figure and speak, and not let the obsession get in the way.
Right. And I mean, one of the great things about Carlin is literally that he started his career in radio, and in fact, he started it. One of the earliest gigs he had was in Boston. It was just a short stint that he spent for a handful of months at a radio station, working the board, basically. And when he was there, he met Jack Burns, who was his comedic partner for a couple of years, and then they went their separate ways, but they remained close friends throughout their lives. And older viewers might remember Jack Burns because he was he was half of Burns and Schreiber, which was a popular comedy duo in the 70s on TV. They did a lot of variety show and sort of Tonight Show appearances and stuff. But Carlin had a classic radio voice. I mean, just a very articulate, warm-sounding, natural-sounding voice that was great on the radio. And that's where he sort of developed his sense that he had a voice that people would be interested in hearing. And Jerry Seinfeld has often said that, and you don't think of Jerry Seinfeld as a huge Carlin fan because you kind of assume, well, Jerry Seinfeld works clean. He doesn't drop F-bombs in his act.
And kind of low key.
Very low key. But Carlin went through a whole period way before Seinfeld where he did very observational, humor, silly stuff about the stuff that's in your refrigerator and pocket lint and just silly stuff that Seinfeld would say, what's the deal with that? And Carlin was doing that stuff 20 years before Seinfeld, and Seinfeld will tell you that. And Seinfeld also often talks about how Carlin's voice, just the texture, the quality of his voice, when he was a kid. He said, even if he was saying the dirty words, he just sounded like your favorite uncle, like, sort of telling you something that was a little naughty when the parents weren't around. Even if he was telling a clean joke, it would sound a little naughty. And even if he was telling a dirty joke, he made it sound cleaner because he sounded like it was family, just telling you something that it was like, hey, keep it to yourself. Don't tell your parents I told you, And so just the quality of his voice, actually, Seinfeld said was very, appealing to him when he was a kid and really sort of drove him towards comedy.
You got a nice bit in here about the, not only about the radio voice, but knocking radio, the boss. And boss being everything boss. You mean the Wonderful Wino bit, or the... you have to sound boss at the radio station, and then there's the boss. And
yeah, right. I can't,
can't recall it.
One of the things that's funny for me or challenging for me about writing comedy is that my memory for long, I'm the sort of person who can't remember. I think that's probably part of the reason why I'm fascinated with comedians and with Carlin, because someone who can just sort of at a cocktail party sit down and tell a long, drawn-out joke. I've never been the person, so many people can't remember jokes like that. I've never been able to remember them, and so that to me is, to be able to have that kind of, rote memorization of, just a card catalog of jokes is, so I can't repeat I know what you're talking about. I can't repeat the joke for you.
I don't have the full joke in my mind either, but I was intrigued because you brought up WBCN radio.
Oh, yeah.
And local stuff that people in Boston can relate to here.
Right.
It's fascinating stuff, and he had quite a life's journey, didn't he?
He did. He went through his struggles like a lot of his peers did with drug use, changed his onstage persona to an extent, because he went from this sort of mellow, the hippy-dippy weatherman guy, and then the first several albums are all very much, you can sort of tell that he's been smoking pot and, is not particularly apologetic about it, but he's got a very sort of mellow, groovy, kind of gentle persona on stage. And then he got edgier, and the late 70s, he, you know, talked about it a lot. He got into heavy cocaine abuse like a lot of his peers did.
Yikes.
And you know, it affected his professionalism, and he knew that it was turning the comedy edgier, but he also knew that it was starting to make him sort of, you know, causing him to, you know, be personally irresponsible and missing some occasional dates and stuff like that. So he just sort of, early 80s, just sort of said, that's it, I'm strong-willed enough, I can't do it anymore, I stop. And he also, you know, not coincidentally, started having heart attacks in the early 80s when he was about 40. And so he realized, I got to stop, I got to clean myself up. And he lived pretty much a clean lifestyle from then on, kind of figuring, if I've already got, his father died really young of heart disease, and Carlin knew after having his first heart attack that he was going to struggle with heart problems, and realized he had to clean up his act if he was going to live a long time. He got 30 more years out of himself, definitely had a few more issues with his heart problem, and also had at least one other incident where maybe 5 years ago or so, he came out in the press and said, I sort of accidentally developed an addiction to Vicodin. And so I put myself into rehab for that. So, you know, he struggled all his life with personal problems like that, but, you know, fought hard and was very proud of himself for quitting cocaine on his own and not having to go to rehab for it.
You should listen to the Fugs about that coke. But, sorry. Intriguing thing. The man, and I had a really good question there until I come up with the joke, but we're actually running out of time. Do you have a website?
Yeah, JamesSullivanAuthor.com.
JamesSullivanAuthor.com.
And I'm on Twitter at Sullivan James. There are too many Jim Sullivans and James Sullivans in the world, and certainly in Boston. So it's just inverted on Twitter. It's Sullivan James.
Interesting. And did you plan to have the book out around the second anniversary?
Actually, we planned to have the book out a little earlier, and then we found out that Carlin himself had been, I knew that he had been working on an autobiography, but a long time ago, about 10 years ago. He sort of set it aside and forgot about it. After his death, his daughter was the first phone call I made when I signed to do my book, and she said, good luck to you. Unfortunately, I'm sort of busy with my own project, which is resurrecting my dad's autobiography, which came out last fall. It's called Last Words. My publisher said, well, we can't go head-to-head with the guy himself. Let's have your book come out about 6 months later, which is what we did. His book is, as it turns out, very personal, very much looking at where his own head was at throughout his career, at the expense of where the rest of American comedy was around him and what was influencing him and how he was influencing other comedians. And that's kind of the book that I intended to write. So hopefully this is the case, but I sort of feel like the two books actually work really well together.
You've done a great job. Thank you so much for being on Writer's Corner Visual Radio with us, James.
Thanks
and good luck with the book.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
And thanks to all of you for watching another edition of Writer's Corner. The book is 7 Dirty Words, The Life and Crimes of George Carlin by James Sullivan. Here on WinCAM.